Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. Okay, welcome everybody to the show. We're going to be talking about one of three growth levers for retailers, and that is brick and mortar expansion, specifically site selection. And I am joined today by a real Renaissance man, Hannibal Baldwin. He's the CEO of SiteZeus, and he experienced this pain firsthand and then solved it with software. And now he's helping retailers, the biggest ones that you've heard of, hundreds of them, every day, help to accelerate and expand their site selection and market expansion efforts. Welcome to the show, Hannibal.
Thanks for having me, Lyden. I'm super excited, and we've known each other probably coming up close to a decade, so really excited to just be on with you and talk shop, man.
Yeah, rock and roll. Well, let's start. How in the world did you get into this business?
Yeah, I know you kind of dabbled in kind of my background a little bit, but to just give you the full story, I got to rewind probably to 2011, 2010. I was just graduating college from USF, and my brother was as well. He's about a year ahead of me. And we didn't know what we wanted to do. I was 20 years old, and he was, I want to say 23 or 24. And his college roommate, really great individual and great family we ended up partnering with. His father was driving through Arizona, this kind of the story, and found this really cool yogurt, self-serve yogurt concept called Yogurtology. And the founder, David Vasquez, what a brilliant creative individual, built this brand and a phenomenal premium yogurts, etc. And Keenan, my brother's college roommate's father, ended up buying the rights to grow that franchise from the founder for the whole state of Florida. And, when we got out of college, we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do. And we ended up partnering with them after they built the first store here in Tampa, Florida. He and I jumped right into business with them, and we started building out stores 50-50. And, from that point on, the first store was a home run store. Second store we did in St. Petersburg on 4th Street down here in Tampa Bay area. Third one was in Sarasota, which is just south of St. Pete. All three of the stores were making money. Right. And site selection wasn't even on my radar, much less I think Keenan's radar. I think we were lucky because our partners happened to have a background in commercial real estate. And so they kind of had a handle on, retail and concepts and owned some good real estate themselves. And so I think we were lucky in that sense. But on the fourth site we did out in Citrus Park, which is north of St. Petersburg, we put a couple $100,000 into the store. We signed a 10-year lease and ended up having to write checks into the business every month, meaning, it did not perform. The sales were not high. We were losing money, and you had a 10-year lease. And so that was our...
how old are you at this point when you're writing checks into the business?
21. And I say, we were writing checks. It was obviously a loan from our father as we got out of college, but, it wasn't a fun position to be in, right? Going from, making money with three stores. And it's a similar story that I hear from a lot of other restaurant founders or retail founders, anybody in the brick and mortar industry, is, you have a few really good units and then you build your first bad performing site and it hurts. And the way I say it is one bad site can take out 3 or 4 good ones from a profitability standpoint. And it's really a drag on the business. For franchise orgs, it drags the AUV down, the average unit volume. So it's not as exciting as a franchisee to, buy into a concept or buy a franchise where the AUVs aren't as high. But nonetheless, that's kind of where we had our first pain and we cut our teeth in site selection. And, I would say the journey towards SiteZeus, the company we founded in 2014, started there with that pain. And I took a step back. I graduated with a degree in finance, and I really gravitated towards statistics, and I've always loved math my entire life. And I just started digging into data. So I went to Esri, which is they own 40% of the GIS market share. And I just got some demographics from their business analyst online product. And I started putting stuff in spreadsheets, that data in spreadsheets. I got competitor sales as best I could. I got our own sales from the 4 stores we had, and I built what I look back and say is very embarrassing now, which is a good thing. This, I wouldn't even call it a model, but like kind of a correlative analysis of, what mattered. And the takeaway was pretty simple in Citrus Park. It was, well, your population density in a 1 mile and a 3 mile trade area is 1/5 of your other 3 stores. And so let's just start with basic population, much less than income and other factors. So that was my journey into demographics and understanding, okay, this, it makes sense when you think about it after the fact. Who are your customers and where are they around you really matters to driving sales. And so from that point on, we applied this approach, this correlative analysis. We built 2 of the highest performing stores using that methodology, and we opted out of building a location that had to be closed down 6 months later in Orlando. So, and I say that's probably the most valuable aspect of what we provide now at SiteZeus. It's, yes, we can help pick the good performers, but I think the most important thing we do for brand is identify the mistakes before you make them. And that saves so much money. It affects the ROI and all the capital going into these investments in such a massive way. And we can dive into that later as we talk about other brands and how they're applying it. But that's where we kind of started. And at a certain point, Keenan and I got so excited about this idea that we decided to step away from the day-to-day yogurtology, which our partners took over and handled and still run today. And it's, again, they're a phenomenal family and partners, and I'm super grateful for that whole experience with them to learn, what we've gotten to today. But that's where we took this idea and then started building a software around it. And we can dive into that whole experience, but it was quite a learning curve going from running a yogurt store to then now building a SaaS product starting in 2013.
This is one of the things that I love about you. It's why I call you a Renaissance man, is because what I've noticed is that you are very interested and great at the design of things. Like there's like an art part of it, but then you also were willing to open up that spreadsheet and build a financial model and then get into Esri, which I feel like I had my moment of getting into Esri and digging into and then downloading all these CSVs and then putting them all together. Like I definitely 100% get that. And I love that. And if you haven't talked to Hannibal when he is in his office, he also has a picture behind him that looks professionally done, and it's something that he actually painted. Which I love that about you, man.
Yeah.
What point was there a point where you were, because you said Keenan, you got really interested in this. What point did you feel conviction that this was something that you wanted to invest in solve? Was it looking at a spreadsheet? Was it the outcome of not choosing the wrong location? Well, what moment was it?
I think I remember, at least the defining moment in my mind, whether that's true or not, you never know. But I remember I used to live with my grandfather when I was 20, got out of college, and we were up in my office. I call it my office. It was his old office that I worked out of. And I was sitting with Keenan, and we're like, this is really powerful. We had stuff loaded on Esri. We had this model spreadsheet that we uploaded. We had little logos. And look, to be honest, I was totally naive to the entire market that already existed. Like there's great, I call them, there are competitors, but they're great companies, companies like, Buxton or Forum or Tango Analytics. I had no idea that any of these folks existed. And that's kind of like first time founder syndrome, right? You're just so naive that we thought, wow, every retailer, we thought 2 things as I simplify it. One, any brick and mortar business has to encounter this problem. That we were right about. I don't care what brick and mortar brand you are. If you tell me that you haven't built a poor performing site, you're lying, right? Like everyone's got the poor performers in the portfolio they would rather not have made the decision on. So, and if you haven't yet, it's only a matter of time, right? If you're in your first or second store, it's only a matter of time before you feel that real pain. The second thing, which was very naive, but I also believe, and I'm grateful for that naivety, because I think it led to our innovation, was that we just didn't know about the competitive landscape. I didn't know about these competitors that we then learned about a year in or 2 years in as you start to try and sell the software, you're speaking to companies. We were kind of just living in our bubble. I do think that when you're almost ungrounded in that sense, and you're just trying to solve a problem, And that was in 2013 where, big data was the term. Machine learning wasn't even really a term yet, right? You had all the statistical and the neural networks and the random forests and all the stuff we looked at and leveraged over the years, but no one was calling it machine learning. It hadn't really been democratized yet. And then you had, web-based technology, cloud-based technology, where, it's SaaS. So we kind of put those three things together and we just imagine like, look, if you're going to solve this problem, how would you want to build a product? And that's where we're like, well, I'd want to just take my sales data, some characteristics about my sites, and I'd want to load it in. And I'd want, magically the platform to just go get all the trade area characteristics, the demographics, the spatial data we have now from you guys, all the different stuff we pull it all in, train a machine learning model, and right there on the interface, and then show me the results when we're done. And let me look at the accuracy and let me start using it. That's what we imagined. And that's what we built. And I still think today, I'm so blown away by it. And it's not tooting our own horn. It's rather just, I'm very curious why it still hasn't been matched. But when I look at all the competition even today, no one in our industry built a platform that can build, train, and deploy these models at will, right? From a user experience standpoint, right? Everyone still is building these models with human statisticians or data scientists, whatever you want to call them, not in the platform. They're building it outside of it, and then they're hooking it up and kind of have what I call a bolt-on technology in some sense. So that was the core innovation that we had 10 years ago, and it's still driving. It's at the core of all the innovation that we build around it today. So I don't know where I was going with that, and I don't even remember what question you asked, but that's kind of where I arrived.
Well, I'm curious for you. So you dealt with this pain as, I would say, a smaller franchisee, but you've also dealt with companies that have 2,000 units site selection. How should you think about if you're a smaller emerging brand doing site selection versus how should someone with 500 units, 2,000 units be thinking about it differently?
Totally. I mean, it's a phenomenal question. And some of it's actually going to relate quite specifically to your platform, Persona Live, and the products you've built. So I'll start with the emerging brand, right? If you've only got 1 or 2 or 3 stores, or even no stores, and you're building a concept, you don't have enough sales data or units, as we call them, stores, to really leverage machine learning in a valuable way in the sense of how our enterprise platform works, as we call it. So our defining line is around 50 stores. Really around 40 to 50 stores, you start to see this directional accuracy emerge out of the machine learning models that we leverage. It's still a small sample, right? But we believe at that level, we can drive statistically better decision-making with a machine learning model in forecasting sales than per se just a human could, right? Pre 40 to 50 units, our approach is rather, let's understand who your core customer is. And the way we do that is through SiteZeus Market, which we've built on top of your data and your platform with Persona Live, the Spatial.ai. And, that's kind of our thought process is, one, these early emerging brands, they might have an idea of who their customer is, but I think we can really hit 2 birds with 1 stone in the sense of, all right, let's figure out who's walking to your doors, where they're coming from. Let's tie them back to those households, right? And understand what persona or segment they are in your data set. And then let's go figure out where more of those individuals reside if you're looking in new markets or new trade areas. And that's kind of how you have to look at site selection, among a variety of other things like the real estate, the signage, the access, all of that stuff you have to go visit. But I think the core thing where brands make big mistakes is, are you or are you not optimally positioned around your target customer, right? That's the first question to answer. Second to that, it's like a pipeline of not faucets, but what's the right word? If you had a pipeline of potential transactions from customers or money
funnel, like a funnel,
right? With all these valves, right? The first valve you have to open is position on your customer. The second might be get to access points, get the right traffic count, right? So on and so forth. And any time you get one of those questions or valves wrong and it's only half open and it's not optimal, you're essentially, you're removing the throughput of transactions or, customer flow into your store. So that's kind of the way I visualize it in my mind. It's a pipeline, and you've got to free up the valves as best you can, and those are all the decisions you make in the site selection process.
So when you're smaller, then it's like, okay, just make sure, and like even with your example, it's like you need your core customer there, and you need them in a reasonable volume. So you had a really low population density of 1/5, which is like there just wasn't enough people there. So that's number one. And then the second thing that you should be looking at is essentially the variables about the site. Like, can you see the ingress egress of the site? Is there enough foot traffic going across this, or maybe the car traffic competition? Okay. Yeah. What about when it gets into these larger brands that have just tons of units?
Yeah. So yeah, that's like for 0 to 50, that's the approach. We'll figure out who your customer is. We'll even run a white space of where those customers are and give you a bunch of seed points along with a variety of other like demographics, traffic volumes, et cetera, that go into that equation, right? But it's kind of a manual formula, as you'd call it, right? And you still have to go visit and see the dirt, and you always have to. As you scale up to a larger enterprise, which we work with companies like Subway in the past and with upwards of 20,000 plus stores, right? You're now sitting on a plethora of data. Mm-hmm. And that's where the machine learning can really drive some significant predictive power. And that's kind of our bread and butter in some sense, where, at the core of our application, we'll take your sales data, or you can literally in a flat file, and then get every characteristic you can about that actual site, square footage, signage, image prototype. Do you have drive-through, no drive-through, you name it. If it's a variable you think affects sales, you can bring it into our system and merge it with all of those other traditional demographics, traffic counts, mobile data, spatial data, all of that stuff. And it all flows through the machine learning to then produce, a model at which we can give you, an accuracy metric and an expected accuracy metric on any given forecast. And so that's how the enterprise brands are really leveraging it today.
I'm curious, when you've gone through this process and now you've done it with hundreds of different companies, has there been a variable, either site variable or a trade area variable, that has begun to stand out consistently across brands that you're like, I don't know if I would have totally expected that, but that is really important thing?
Yeah,
or is it really just brand by brand, these things are different?
No, I mean, there's definitely, like, when I think of site attributes that have emerged, we call them site attributes, meaning anything that's not some standardized data set that we've partnered to get to bring into our ecosystem, but rather it's something you have to specifically go measure yourself or, survey yourself on your insights. I would say, and it makes sense when I say it, I didn't expect it in the beginning, right, of the journey, but it makes total sense, is that, look, we're trying to predict sales of your store. So what affects sales? Well, are your customers around you? Who are they? Where are they? Traffic volumes, all those different things, right? You kind of go from this large trade area characteristics all the way down closer to the site, traffic volumes, the number of access points, right? And then you start to get inside of the store, marketing, operations. And so those are actually, and it's double-edged. Yeah, it's very nuanced with our client models. You got to make sure you don't allow for model leakage. I can get into that. That's a whole rabbit hole though. But what I've seen is, for example, like window service times, NPS, OSAT, number of complaints.
What's OSAT?
Man, I used to. Overall
satisfaction.
Satisfaction. There you go.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Overall satisfaction. There you go. These are all representations of how well the business is operated, right? Which, when you think at the end of the day, anytime you go visit a restaurant or retailer, et cetera, the management's good, the product's good, you like the experience, right? And that affects sales heavily. And you got to think at least 20 to 30%, even for these non-destination brands, more convenience-based brands. And so that's where we've always seen, that's kind of the final frontier of these models, is if you can really get good quantified data on ops and local marketing, or budget tied to each unit on marketing, you can take a model from good to fantastic.
That's so cool. That's the first time I'd ever heard things like including the budget tied to that specific unit on marketing. And what it makes me think of is that you could theoretically use SiteZeus as a tool where you're looking at the performance across all your locations, look at basically the potential of that trade area, and then where you have like specific locations where they're over indexing on what they theoretically should be doing. We can look and say, is this an operator thing? Is it a marketing thing? And these are interesting to study, to like, maybe this operator has a model that we can now apply across the other ones. Because the problem is, if you open up a new location somewhere else, you're not guaranteed going to have that operator. But if you can sort of like take their operational capabilities, playbook it, and input into these other places, you're just going to improve your chance of success.
Totally. No, it's something where you have like your attributes that you can score on each side, and it changes things. And it's pretty wild to see, when you get franchise orgs or even corporate orgs, you have the district manager, you have the franchisee operator, and that's literally a variable, a name of the individual. And it'll learn which names, along paired with, the OSATs and the other scores that correlate with the operator name. You can run forecasts for whole market with this operator or that operator, and you can see the change in unit volumes based on ops. And so what's really cool for a brand is look, yes, site selection is a big part of it, but our models also know how to essentially hold constant what variability or risk profile for each site independently is associated with the operator, because not every site's made equally. Some sites and the trade area characteristics will stand up more resiliently to maybe poor operations than others. Like you might have a $1 million range on good to bad operations on a site, whereas other sites you might only have a $500,000 range. And so like all sites aren't created equal. And that's where that is, if I could explain the value of machine learning, that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's lay some foundation here. I would like to break down the process of when a retailer comes to you guys at SiteZeus and says, I'm ready to expand locations. What process do you take them through step by step? And obviously that your software will facilitate a lot of this, but there's mechanical and functional things that you have to do. What's that step by step? Let's break that down.
No, I think in some sense, I might even, maybe this isn't answering the question, but I'll start with our sales process, right? And it is going to depend on whether you're a emerging or enterprise brand. We're going to try and end up in a similar place of, giving you the ability to grade or forecast your sites, and also a white space or a market mapped plan across the United States of where do you need to be looking proactively, right? But I mean, the questions when a brand comes to us, and the first things you ask is, look, what are you doing today? You need to understand where you're meeting the brand, right? Are you leveraging a software today? Are you looking at demographics, right? If you're a really small emerging brand, you might not even be aware of any of that stuff. Do you understand who your customer is? Like, so you're just trying to gauge in what we call discover, right? Where is the brand at in their maturity cycle and sophistication associated with this? Are you leveraging a predictive model already, right? And then from there, right, if you lean towards the enterprise side, what we actually do in our sales process is run a proof of concept. And we do this on purpose, and we learn this through trial and error of, for both sides. When you're selling predictive modeling, you're selling accuracy, right? You're selling predictions. And so if you sell predictive modeling, especially in the early days of the company, and you don't know what data you're going to get from the brand, you don't know how good the model is going to be. And so you could sell someone on a contract where you might not have a really good model. And then you create a lot of dissatisfaction, right? We learned early on. As we said, let's just build a proof of concept model on the front side where the client puts up a nominal fee so that, one, we learn, okay, this brand has budget. They understand they're serious about solving this problem. They'll put a little bit of skin in the game. Let's go build the first version of the model. And this actually really spoke to our value prop that I went back to that's at the core. It's like, we can stand up these models and spin them up in hours or minutes. Usually we'll wait for the data from the client. We'll say, hey, we'll come back to you a week from now, right? But we're doing it with our own product in minutes to hours. And we'll take their, first version of their data. It's like, hey, send us your trailing 12-month sales, send us any characteristics you have on the site. And then instead of running you a generic demo of our product, I'm going to show you the first and worst version of your model inside of SiteZeus. And then you get to make a decision on whether this is good enough for you to want to spend the money and make the investment into continuing to train the model, get more data, and optimize this thing to go leverage. And that's really de-risked a lot of dissatisfaction potential post-sale, and also given the brand a way to de-risk, their investment into something that may not work. Because look, we don't want to sell a brand where we can't build a good model for them either. So
let's talk about, I'm curious about some of those site characteristics. What do you like to see, and what are some important site characteristics that you find that retailers, restaurants are not capturing that they should be?
Yep. It's, with a lot of the site characteristics, I'll tell you, a lot of brands do not have really good data when it comes to that. We've been across a few, and if they previously built a model, they usually have better data than not. But still, when you're talking about brands that have 500, 1,000, 2,000 units, you have to survey all these sites. You have to look and make sure you've got quality control of the data you're getting. You're probably using Google Maps, or you're sending out surveys to your field to get this data. And so, you want to get your hands on like number of access points, distance from the road, the prototype, right? All these brands have different store prototypes depending on the year and the branding, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Digital signage, drive-through, anything. We ask them like, hey, we want to quantify anything that you actually think or believe internally is really relevant to your sales. And so you can kind of, get there by asking those kind of questions. But then it really is, hey, do you have, how are you performing marketing today? Are you doing TV marketing? Are you doing radio? Are you doing digital? How do you tie that back to units? Are you franchised? Are you not franchised? Who is your franchise operator? The names. We really want to get our hands on that data, because you will hit a ceiling on accuracy if you do not leverage ops or marketing, right? And so that's why I lead back to there. Like, we want to get all the traditional characteristics of the site, like square footage, signage, all those things, right? You can't not have those. But you also can't not get your hands on ops and marketing. You can, but you're going to limit the model's ability. And let's call it, you might end up at what I call an 80% accurate model, where, you're just going eyes wide open into, we're going to have a 20% variance in each forecast, because it's training to, it doesn't know anything about ops or marketing. And so it's just training noise. You're going to have that error of the model, right?
So once you have that, what SiteZeus has is the Olympus Data Exchange, of which we are one piece in that exchange. There's a bunch of different characteristics about trade areas usually. So how do you determine, and especially with the really, you're running this model extremely quickly compared to how it's been done historically. How do you determine the trade areas around those? Is it like, if you want to run it quickly, we just need to do radius rings, or is it drive times is the right way to do it? Like, how do you do it quickly? And then I guess second is, if you had your optimal trade area, how would you do that?
Yeah. So we can do all of the above. Over the years, it started with, we just started with radiuses, then we added drive times, and then you can build in custom sets. And so for each of your stores, the user has explicit control over what trade area they want to set for your site. You can do radiuses, you can do drive times, or you can be like, I want to literally draw the trade area, or I want to use mobile polygons, or I want to, whatever they want. You can bring in GeoJSON shapes specific for each site, to where it's pulling that shape's data for that site that goes into the machine learning that feeds all the variables in. So, you have ultimate flexibility when it comes to that. And you also have the ability to let the ML, or let SiteZeus, decide, and it'll actually just spin up and run a bunch of different models and pick the most accurate one.
How is the machine learning sort of like, I guess it's the machine learning is trying multiple trade areas and using all the variables within those trade areas, and then giving you the one that's the most predictive. Is there a situation where you would not choose the most predictive model? Or is it pretty much like, no, we really want this accuracy?
This happens quite a bit. Look, like there's this big, as we've learned, and we did a webinar with Raising Canes recently, where we talked through, look, there's a trade-off between accuracy and explainability. And this is a problem. This is an AI problem, right?
That's right.
If you want the most predictive model, it's probably the one you can explain least. And so sometimes you might find it picks a trade area where the client is like, that's not my trade area. I know people travel farther, and you end up having to have this large discussion of, look, the AI doesn't really care how it predicts what the outcome is. It just cares about getting it right or wrong. And so there's all these indirect ways that, for example, the best example I have is like, I can use latitude and longitude as a variable that kind of encompasses a whole demographic profile shift from market to market. So I can encompass the signal of maybe 100 or 200 demographic variables just with a latitude, longitude, right? How do you explain that, in a really explainable way? Just like, if it picks a 1 mile trader and you think it's 3, and maybe it is more like a 3, well, it's finding some indirect pattern that we as humans can't see that's giving it signal to predict better outcomes, and we test it. So it's not like we believe this. It's like, no, the model, we do cross-validation, which I can go into that rabbit hole, where we essentially will build a series of models with a subset of your data held out each time, different subset of data held out each time, then we forecast back on it. So we kind of back test how well does this model do with this trader and these variables, et cetera. And so, you can argue the explainability, like, hey, I don't know that if we want to show this to franchisees, or I don't know if this is going to go well on the site committee in the boardroom. Like, it's just, and so we built our platform where you can manage and tune every variable that you want to go in your model. You can explicitly control the trade area if you want to. You can manage the cross-validation settings. We have all this parameterization, as I call it, or optimization ability of the models in a whole dashboard. So you can kind of be your own data scientist, but with all the bumper lanes you need without having to know, the ins and outs of the data science.
Some of that I understand from the retailer side, because ultimately, like, the accuracy is one thing, but they politically, I guess might be the right word, they have to get the deal done. Right. And so when you're in the real estate committee, if you throw out some esoteric variable, and people are going to, their eyes are going to glaze over. But if you say, hey, listen, we're going for areas that have this level of population and these ethnicity mixes, and maybe one other, like a site characteristic, that can get a deal done internally, theoretically better. And really, I think it just depends on who you're working with.
Yeah.
Who's ultimately making that decision on what you do.
No, you're defining the big rub, right? That this friction point that comes into play in our industry, and what we're solving for is you kind of have to take a step back every once in a while with the client and say, look, it's human nature to want to simplify things, right? And if you don't understand it, it's harder to trust. So we know that. And a lot of brands will come to you, and traditionally a lot of folks that have been in real estate, and it makes sense. They're like, look, I just need to know the top 5 variables that are all similar at my top performing sites, right? That's what I want to be able to tell my franchise community, track franchisees with, and walk into the boardroom with. Say, okay, we can do that. But we all know, like, that's an 80-20 rule. So 20%, you're going to have some bad sites if you use that rule of thumb. You want to get that extra 20% right, you've got to use machine learning, where nuance, one-offs, exceptions happen every day. And that's where the pattern recognition of ML is going to pick that up more frequently than you as a human are. But you're not, we've got ways of explaining it, right? But it's just going to take a little more effort to dig in and understand, okay, why is the forecast, is what it is here. And we provide smart comps, we provide all the variable impact, right? But it's not as simple. It's a very hard problem. And we learned that the hard way. Like, we used to just chase accuracy, and explainability wasn't as big, and people would come back and like, I can't sell this in the boardroom, Hannibal. Like, what are you feeding me? And so we've really had to balance and let folks like, look, and brands sit on different spectrums, right? If they need a more explainable model, like, hey, just put 20 variables in the model, let's limit it, let's make it this trade area size, we'll go eyes wide open and say, look, we can build that model. It's a 84%. And if you train it with everything and it's less explainable, it's an 89%. You make the call on what's more valuable to your organization. What's that healthy mix?
Yeah. You know what, you're talking about this, it's kind of reminding me of my conversation I had with Kenneth Grombach, who's a demographer. And what you have in the workforce right now is you have data scientists that they lean younger, essentially, like the millennials. We're seeing some Gen Z out there. So the data scientists have some comfort with the like variables in combination, for example, in machine learning models. But the people that are still making a lot of the calls and decisions, and this is changing. But I mean, the baby boomer population is so much bigger than Generation X. X kind of bridges that divide a little bit, but it's still a lot of the baby boomers, and so you almost have not only a methodological divide, you also have a bit of a generational divide in communication. And I'm thinking about the people that are the retail analysts and that are listening to this conversation. It feels like the right way to do this is to leverage that machine learning to the highest extent that we can. But there's a way that you tell the story externally. Like maybe we don't bring them into all the detailed variables, but we do pick out the variables that we know our manager is going to resonate with, and we use that as part of the story. That feels like the ideal situation where you can essentially have your cake with the machine learning model and eat it too, with getting the deal done.
No, and I would say the best performing brands we work with, the most disciplined ones, they've actually balanced the real estate teams with both, right? So there's something to be said for what I would I'm going to stereotype in some sense, but like a lot of directors of real estate that have been doing the job for 20, 30 years, they're on the field, out in the field, 4 out of 5 days of the week, traveling, looking at sites. They've got their own neural network up here, and that's not discounted, right? And that's the art, right? Those neural nets that live inside of those minds, that's the art, right? They know, they've got that sixth sense of, hey, the ML is not picking up on this thing and it's not going to perform well, and I can call it, right? Or sometimes it might be the opposite. Like, I just know. I also know all this other information that's not quantified yet, right? That general intelligence, right? The best teams I've seen get those individuals that have 30 years of experience. They know markets like the back of the hand, but then they also have the users and end users of SiteZeus, literally a real estate analyst or a data scientist on the real estate team that can bridge, and build trust with, look, I know how the ML works. We're going to train the models. We're going to juice it for accuracy, but I'm also going to try and optimize as much as I can for explainability without trading off too much accuracy. And then they can interpret the results much easier, right, as a user, to then kind of build a bridge story, build reports that still give the franchise community or the field real estate folks more comfort of like, look for these 5 or 10 things, but also here's your forecast. Sometimes they'll disagree. And you have to remind folks, that's the value of what you bought. If you bought SiteZeus to agree with you every time, then you have wasted your money, right? That's the ironic part about what we do.
So the next part is like you've got all these variables that you've surfaced, and you have some sort of predictive model, or if you're an emerging brand, you have the checklist that you're looking for that seems like just directionally correct. Then how do you then apply that to a map and then find that next location? What should people be thinking about at this point when they have sort of the tool to hone in and target?
Yeah, so it's a phenomenal question, and I remember we built this feature, and it's one of my favorite features that we built in SiteZeus, Locate. Now we could talk about the whole other vision of where we're going as a company, but so you've got a model, it can produce a forecast. So our big question like 4 or 5 years ago is, okay, well, how do we brute force a ton of forecasts, like tens of thousands, to spread the United States with a bunch of potential forecasts? And where do we get the seed points for that, right? So whether you're an emerging brand, right, or an enterprise brand, we've got an approach to this, and it's called Site Sonar. And what we've essentially done is we've taken the nation's point of interest database, right? So any retail or restaurant or point of interest, you can turn on Site Sonar. You can say, hey, say I'm a coffee shop, right? Or say, I'm a coffee shop. Well, what kind of real estate would you traditionally look for? Well, Starbucks is probably in a lot of great retail centers, et cetera. So let me just click all 14,000 Starbucks that exist in the United States, and let me run my coffee forecast on their real estate. It has nothing to do with how Starbucks would perform other than use that latitude, longitude, because they're in a realistic place I could build a coffee shop, most likely. Mm-hmm. Or you could do all the grocery centers or whatever you want, right? You can essentially
So if you're a brand that you need a grocery anchor, then you're just going to do that grocery centers across the entire.
The Walmarts, the HEBs, and go run my forecast on the real estate. And the idea behind that is essentially pre-plan all your markets with what we call these trade area seeds, right? And then you can set revenue filters. So it's like, all right, give me 50,000 forecasts across the United States on all these points of interest with my model, my forecast. And then filter it down based on, hey, I need only unit volumes that projecting over $1 million and are at least 3 miles away from either one of my planned sites or existing sites, right? So now you've essentially got this market plan with trader seeds that then, I think this is the big thing we're allowing with this is letting the brands go to their brokers and their franchisee networks and say, look, don't bring me sites just randomly or reactively and let me forecast on them. Here is the plan. Go look for real estate around these trade area seeds because they're likely to be better performing, right? And so you're flipping real estate from a reactive process, which we always see a lot of, and with especially with emerging brands, it's just like franchisees are like, I know this market, I like this site, and the broker says it's good, and the brand's like, okay, right? Because they do want to grow, they want to get more units, but that's where a lot of brands make mistakes is they run a reactive real estate process, and what we'd like to drive is a proactive real estate process that even bleeds into, if you're a franchise organization, the big problem I have with is franchise sales leads real estate. Real estate comes after franchise sales. And in my mind, real estate planning or market planning needs to come before franchise sales. So
I see
where the units are going, I know what they're going to do. I know how many units I can sell in these small little slivers of territories that I can kind of use as Legos or building blocks to sell a market. And the franchise sales team is selling a market that real estate can very closely execute on. And there's big friction in franchise orgs where like franchise sales sells a 60-unit deal in, Atlanta, Georgia, and real estate's like, there's only 30 stores I can build over $1 million. It's if you don't have those analytics on the front end, you're going to make a lot of mistakes where it always happens. Brands either under or oversell their territories. And there's always lawsuits and stripping territory away from franchisees. Like there's a plethora of issues that are downstream from that.
From a corporate level, it feels like this is juicy because we're getting into the chessboard. Like we know our moves, we got our model, we know our moves, and then we just got to choose these moves. How should they be thinking about in the corporate level about what new markets to enter in? Is there strategy there? Like, should they stay closer to where they are physically? Like, what are the other data points that they should be looking at, or beyond just the predictive model piece?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that's where two things come to mind. One is SiteZeus Market and what we're doing with Persona Live, right? So you've got this forecasting model, right? But every forecast isn't created equal. And then you've also got with SiteZeus Market, understanding who your core customer is. And it's very easy. I kind of like looking at both approaches, like what market do you want to go to next? Well, let's look at two things and make sure they agree. One, who's if we're in Atlanta, Georgia, and we want to go to Austin, Texas, right? Different cities, different cultures, different makeups, right? Who's my core customer segment in Atlanta? And then let's just double check that with Austin. Are those same segments in high propensity in Austin, Texas? If they're not, it doesn't mean it's not going to be a good market for you. You might have a new segment that loves your brand there, but it's higher risk, right? And then let's also check the model, the site sonar results. Okay, what are the forecasts we're getting? Are they overperforming? We've got this secondary analytic called the smart comps. And what that does is it shows you how similar a forecast is based on all these different data points to your existing stores in your portfolio. So it'll show you rank order of comps. Your number one comp is the most similar portfolio site in your portfolio to the site you're forecasting.
Oh, that's super cool. So we can now, that's such a good thing. We can relate it to, you're in that board meeting, you're like, oh, this is like our Atlanta site that we know does this amount.
Exactly. And so what we're doing is we're saying, okay, here are your comps. What we give you with that is a similarity score. So if I'm getting 90 percentile similarity scores, which I probably wouldn't going from Atlanta to Austin because they're not going to be that similar, right? Or some of them might, but in general, they might not. I might have lower similarity scores. So if I'm seeing lower similarity scores and maybe not a ton of my same segment there, it doesn't mean Austin's not going to work. It just means it's higher risk, right? And we also, there's another analytic we provide, which is the prediction interval. So if you're seeing wider intervals or higher risk, we measure the risk in every forecast. You'll notice that with markets. So it's a combination of those three analytics where, sometimes it is like, hey, for supply chain reasons or distribution, it's easier to go in proximity to where you're at. And I'm trying to think of a good example of this, like, that would be like being in Orlando, Florida, and moving to Miami. It's close in proximity, but the demographic makeup is wildly different.
Yeah, I hear you.
Proximity does not equate to lower risk, right? So what I look for is those similarity scores, and then tying it back to SiteZeus market and Persona Live segment. So, is this a similar makeup market or similar type city as what I'm already in, and that will translate to probably lower or similar execution risk.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, we kind of expand back out. You had the moment when you looked at your specific location for the yogatology and didn't have your customer profile there. You're saying that this is also applying here at a national level, where you're like, step one, we always got to know, are our customers there? And then you're using the SiteZeus market that leverages the Persona Live segmentation to do that. Step two is you've got the similarity scores. So now we can see, okay, are these sites similar? And then you have that risk profile too. So you can use those 3 steps to do that. When they actually are about to hone in on a singular site, what are some of the things just practically that they need to be thinking about on that site? Like, is there anything that should be considering about with like tax implications or labor? What are some of gotchas on those sites where it's like, it legitimately could be a good performing site, but there's other things that could affect that?
Yeah, you'd like to think revenue is everything, but it's not. And I think the really sophisticated brands, they tie in a really mature or more sophisticated financial process to the real estate committee process, right? So let's say I get a really good top line forecast, right? Well, what market am I in? What are my COGS likely to be? What's my labor in that market? That's something that the CFO or the finance team is going to have more optics on, and they're going to build a P&L against that site forecast, right? So I'm going to New York City. Yeah, I need double my average unit volume if I'm going to pay $100 or $120 a foot and pay the minimum wages up there, et cetera, right? Like, and what are my COGS going to be? So you just, your operating gross margin is just going to, like, you've got to plan for that. And so what we've seen, it kind of ties into, like, one of the surprises I've seen quite often is a lot of our client models will, you'll have some really good forecasts in really urban cities, right? Like, in urban markets, and because there's a lot of density, but there's also a lot of competition. So there's opportunities, right, on 123 Main Street, and that's where I see, like, where we help a lot is where a lot of real estate folks, they know those, where everyone wants to be, and yes, it's a really good place to be. But if everybody's there, your share of stomach, if you're a restaurant, is just, you're competing for share of stomach. You're not even competing for your specific, sub-industry, whether you're like a sub shop or your Chipotle, whatever it is. And we see a lot higher forecasts with better economics on the labor and COGS and rent front when you go into these suburban or even, quasi-rural markets where competition is lower, your economics to run the actual site are lower. And yeah, you might be like slightly above average or an AUV forecast, but your EBITDA and your cash flow and your economics, your unit level economics are phenomenal in what I call these tertiary markets. And the brands that are really paying attention to that, executing on that, I think they really show over performance. And that's kind of this hidden gem opportunity that I see as a pattern quite frequently with a lot of the brands that we work with.
Yeah, it's making me think of Tractor Supply Company that I'm sure they pick up some pretty cheap real estate. I can't remember what the other one is, but there's like a dollar, I don't know, Dollar Tree or Family Dollar, one of those concepts, primarily actually just rural areas, and so they can build real cheap. You go in there, it's Dollar General, that's the one, and in there you can see it's like they're using concrete to build it up, so they can build it really cheaply too.
No doubt, but it's those brands, have figured that out and they've made it their core strategy, I think there's a ton of opportunity for a lot of brands you wouldn't think traditionally go into those markets that there's a lot of opportunity. They're just not paying attention to.
As a brand, when do you know you're ready to add a new location?
That's a good question. I mean, going back to my own experience, it's usually when one, you've probably optimized your ability to scale the org, right? So like if you put in all the systems and processes and people you can at that level without breaking the bank to say, oh, I want to go grow another 5 or 10 units, right? And then if you're doing that, I think it all starts with, okay, like, are your same store sales where you want them to be? That's kind of the first question we ask folks, because if it's not, then we're not talking about our locate product, we're talking about our market product, because that's the big thing we talked about here is SiteZeus Market helps you understand who your customers are with the persona life segments from Spatial. But it not only helps you do that for position real estate, but I would say even further, it helps you understand that so you can get more of them back into your doors, right? To drive more transactions, which drive same store sales. That's the core value prop of market, right? Okay, let me take the same amount of ad dollars I was spending on these segments and deploying it into all of the same channels, just with a targeted audience. And I'm going to get better outcomes, better click-through rates, and more transactions, right? If I've solved that problem first, I've got really good AUVs, I've got good same-store sales growth, then you're likely in a more right position to go sell franchisees, go raise money from investors to deploy in corporate growth, whatever the path.
Yeah. Yeah. The way that I think about retail expansion specifically is I think of 3 levers. One is open up a new store. Number 2 is same store sales. So we're just lifting the sales in our current store, selling to more people of those stores. And number 3 is getting those people to spend more. So that could be loyalty programs. It could be anything that's basically increasing the lifetime value of that customer. Those are kind of the 3. There's another one that I don't talk about much, which is pricing. Like you could change your pricing on the stores or the pricing of the merchandise in the stores. So that's kind of I would say, a secondary one. I'm curious for you. I mean, we've been in this really interesting season for retail expansion since 2020 and COVID. I'm curious for you, is there any brands that you've seen they're like since 2020, they've been killing it? Like they've been doing really good at their expansion.
Yeah. Yeah, there's 2, they're clients of ours, because those are the ones I know best that come to mind. There's a lot of great brands we work with, but 2 that just have been absolute powerhouses and have applied really great discipline to their real estate process, at least on the unit count growth, and I think the same store sales growth. On the corporate side, I would say Raising Canes is the most impressive brand I've seen from the real estate team they've built. We just did a webinar with them, and they let us share quite a bit of their data from the models, not their sales data, but like their accuracy with us, how it's grown over, our journey and our partnership with their models of forecasting, how they apply the forecasting, their framework for applying it. And it really uncovers, and I have learned so much from them, right? And like, what are best practices for leveraging an analytic like ours? And they've got a framework, and they're highly disciplined about it, and how they bucket forecasts into 4 different buckets. On target, meaning it's accurate, right? What's the next one? Value killers, which is the most important thing we can forecast. So you want the lowest percentage error here, which is, hey, the store actually performs poorly, but we forecast it really good, right? Directionally accurate, which is, look, it's a binary decision to build or not build the site. It was still the right call, but we were off more than we'd like to be on the forecast, and then missed opportunities, which those suck because you could have deployed capital into something that was going to have a higher ROI, but it's kind of, we walked on something we shouldn't have, right? When they look at our model and they look at our forecast, they measure back test things, they put things in those 4 buckets, and they're extremely disciplined about how they leverage our model, the forecast, the smart comps, the impact forecast, and those similarity scores. And they have, their unit volumes to their unit growth and their same store sales growth has just been mind-blowing to watch. On the franchise side, I would say Culver's has been a very impressive franchise brand that's applied a very similar level of discipline. And I would say, generally speaking, it's harder to apply that discipline in a franchisor. And I want to be careful on how I say this, because it's not that franchising's bad. It's just there's more room for what I call like moral hazard in franchising, in the sense that the franchisor is not putting up the capital to associate with the success of that site. The franchisee is putting their life savings into it. And the franchisor typically makes a royalty on top line sales. They're incentivized to make sure the store doesn't close, because then they don't get their royalty, but they're not really, most franchisors, they tend to try to just grow really, really fast by selling franchises and units. Performance matters, and it'll self-correct, because if you're not performing well enough, nobody's going to line up to spend their money and tie their life savings up into a store that, a brand that may not perform. So like there's, the economics of capitalism play out there, but I think there's still a little more wiggle room at certain periods of time for less discipline in franchise orgs, because you have more decision makers. You've got a franchisee, you got a franchisor, their interests aren't perfectly aligned. And so we try to help really bring what I'd call like responsible franchising to that process, at least from a real estate perspective, and drive that proactive market planning, proactive franchise sales, so on and so forth. But Culver's they're a juggernaut in the franchise space, of watching them grow, and the unit volumes they're doing, and the success they've had, the accuracy they've had.
What is Raising Canes and Culver's doing similarly? Is it an attitude? Is it a resource thing? They're just allocating more resources. Like, what are they doing differently that other brands aren't doing that's making them win?
Yeah, it starts with the framework of like understanding. It's like of course I'm associating this with SiteZeus, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think they have an understanding and a higher level belief and understanding of how to leverage machine learning. So they know what machine learning is. They have people on their team specifically that they get that, right? And it's not just a discipline in real estate. They're just generally more analytical companies. They're more data-driven companies, is what I would say. But they don't overcompensate there. They balance it out with folks who have a lot of industry knowledge. Like the individual, like I know Dale Goss over at Raising Canes, just phenomenal individuals, been doing what he's been doing for, decades. He understands the value of the analytics, the ML, and he's built a team with Brandon and Alec who are highly analytical, and built trust between them. And they operate as this unit where, Dale knows the markets extremely well. He's built a very well-rounded team, and they operate with a lot of really good data and analytics, but they do not also, act blind to like visiting the dirt and like all of the other factors that come into play, with the art, where like you can't, the ML is just not going to pick up on some of those factors, right? So I'd say it's the same in both, where there's just there's a certain higher level of appreciation for analytics culturally.
Yeah. One thing that I feel like I'm getting out of this, and I'm thinking of the analogy of you have a warrior, and that warrior has a tool, and that tool's a sword. And I think when people think about AI, and you guys were way early, like now that LLMs have hit scale just culturally, now everyone's like, oh, AI, like you guys were doing 2014. Yeah. You were doing some of this.
No. Yeah,
you were doing this AI stuff. People really confuse the AI as the warrior out there doing the thing. The AI is at best is a tool in the hand, and it feels like it's these teams that can understand how to use it as a tool. But some words I wrote down that you said, like visiting the dirt, is really important. Understanding the practicalities of a site, like when it comes to egress and ingress, and how many parking spaces you still have to have that. And there's that you called the neural net of the mind. And then you and I, we've learned this as business owners. When you got a gut feeling about something, like you can call it a gut feeling. There's actually signals that your brain is seeing, and they're real. And like as I got older, I have learned to start listening to that. Man, I love how you built SiteZeus. I love how you've really thought about this from a first principle perspective, and it's just one of the reasons I respect you so much. So I've loved having you on the show, Hannibal. If people wanted to get in contact with you or SiteZeus, what do they need to do?
Yeah, I mean, check out our website, SiteZeus.com, or you can email me personally at hbaldwin@SiteZeus.com as well. Happy to hear from any and all, and answer any questions and just help out, whether that's formal or informal.
Rock and roll, man. Thanks, Hannibal.
Appreciate it, Lyden. Thanks for the opportunity, man.